So welcome everybody to our new Conversatory. This time is Conversatory on rights around the world. I hope you are all fine. I know we were expecting to have this part of the year, in a different place. The first three series are going to be on Israel, Palestine, and no one better to kick off this new series that Omar Dajani. Omar Dajani is a professor of law. I need to read all of this, it's too much. I'm co-director of the Global Center at McGeorge School of Law, University of the Pacific. He's a leading expert on legal and political aspects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team in peace talks leading to Camp David and Taba, work with the UN, with the State Department, widely published and for different audience going to academic and politicians, to the general public. What I want to say about Omar is that he navigates, connects, and enriches the fields of international law, negotiation, politics, political science, and Middle East studies with analytical sophistication, acute nuances, and moreover, deep humanism and relentless fairness. He's also an amazing storyteller. Don't get fooled, his soft-spokenness amplifies the strength and thoroughness of his arguments. It's an honor, Omar, to have you here at the Conversatory.
The honor truly is mine, Mara. Thanks so much for an incredibly generous introduction.
Well deserved. So this is a very complex issue, and the picture behind me, I don't think that does, justice to convey the complexity of issues that are involved, a history that predates World War I, international law, the role of international community and imperial powers, the internal dynamics of the most important actors, be it the Middle East, Israel, Palestine, the US, conceptual frameworks, moral claims, understanding of the peace process that is more process actually than peace. It's very difficult to detangle. So we're gonna take that thread and you're gonna help us detangle, these issues. And first I wanna start with your personal involvement, your personal story. How do you get to be invited as a legal advisor for the Palestinian negotiating team?
So I went to law school starting in 1993, which was the year that the Oslo Accords were signed. The Oslo Accords being the set of agreements concluded between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization that created a set of interim arrangements, self-government arrangements for the Palestinians in the occupied territory, pending a permanent resolution of the conflict, which as yet is forthcoming, of course. But it was expected that some 5 years after those agreements were signed, that there would be negotiations on permanent status beginning. It ended up being a little bit later than that because Bibi Netanyahu was elected prime minister. And then in 1999, it was expected that Ehud Barak, who was a center-left politician, would win the premiership in Israel, and that peace negotiations would start in earnest, that permanent status negotiations would start in earnest. And so one of my law school classmates who had worked with me on a few projects that our international law professor had facilitated, projects looking at human rights in the Palestinian Authority, and then at a range of other questions relating to Middle East governance. So this friend of mine reaches out to me and he says, hey, this British development organization called Adam Smith International has acquired funding from the UK government, which feels maybe a little guilt for having started this entire conflict, and which is guided by the conviction that it would be better for everyone if the Palestinians were represented by capable legal counsel in the negotiations. And so would you be willing to leave your law firm for a year? I was working at a firm called Sidley Austin in Washington, D.C., and come to Ramallah and provide advice. And I had just negotiated with my parents. I'd been living in California. I clerked in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is in California. And they had pleaded with me to come back to Washington, and I had agreed. And here, 10 months later, I was being asked to leave again. But luckily, my mother gave me permission. And and I made my way over to Ramallah, and it was a devastating experience ultimately, but also one of the most poignant experiences of my life, and certainly transformative in terms of my sense of what I wanted to do in my life, and also my sense of the role that a lawyer can play, and importantly, the roles that lawyers maybe are unable to play in peace talks.
This is, yeah. So you encounter the main actors, and what was on the table and what had happened till then? Because you said you come, after Oslo, that was Oslo 1 in 93, Oslo 2 in 95. There was the partition within the West Bank with allocation to Palestinian Authority and a kind of timeline that never happened. But before that was the occupation, and before that, the Nakba. I don't mean to be like Garcia Marquez that goes back in time to tell the story. But if we can set these pillars as to how you get to negotiate, what you had to negotiate, and, what worked and what didn't and why.
Sure. Wow.
Maybe that's too much.
Well, there's a lot there, but I'll maybe do my best to bring it back to my family story. So my father was born in Palestine in 1932, and during that time, Palestine was a mandate of Great Britain, meaning that the League of Nations had given to Great Britain the responsibility of guiding Palestine along with other territories in the former Ottoman Empire toward independence. Now, at the same time, Britain had committed to create in Palestine a Jewish national home, and had also committed to help the Arabs, this is in the 19-teens, to resist Ottoman rule. So Britain made multiple commitments to different actors, and each, of course, has its own sense of grievance with respect to that unfolding. But for Palestinians, I'll speak in the first person. Our grievance has been that rather than moving toward achieving independence in our homeland was promised to another, and certainly, of course, promised to another with a tragic 19th and 20th century history, indeed a tragedy extending much further back. I'm speaking, of course, about the Jewish people, and with a sense of attachment to Palestine, which Jews call, of course, the land of Israel, and which later became the state of Israel. Making a long story short, in 1948, in April of 1948, as the civil conflict in Palestine, after years of intensification, a consequence of substantial Jewish immigration into Palestine, and Palestinian frustration with British non-responsiveness to their concerns, and with concerns about what the fate of the land would be. So I'm sorry, I'm getting a little out of order, but in 1947, the British say, you know, we are done with this place. They make clear that they're going to do exactly what the United States has just done in Afghanistan, which is wash their hands of a place after having caused more than a little trouble there. And they announced that in May of 1948, Britain would be leaving. In November of 1947, the United Nations says, you know, the appropriate way to deal with this is to split this country into two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state. This is something that the Arabs at this juncture have a lot of concerns about. They say, well, wait a second, we remain the majority of the population. We own 93% of the land here. And most of the Jews in Palestine at this juncture are fairly recent arrivals. So they reject the idea of partition, and conflict slowly moves from a simmer to gradual intensification between 1947 and April of 1948. And in April 1948, there is, am I going into too much detail, Marta?
I love the detail. I oscillate, to be honest with you, between the details, but I think it's good to set some foundation. I think to understand what we are going to discuss and not discuss, you know, without people actually being able to prime kind of that information. So yes, what I wanted just to add to the story is that Britain was also withdrawing from India at the time. Absolutely,
absolutely. I mean, the partition of India happens in 1947. And so partition is also on the brain in the international system. And we saw population exchanges happening between Greece and Turkey 20 years earlier. And so it was a different moment in terms of notions of what was fair. And there was no widespread decolonization movement at that juncture. But to come back to Palestine, so April of 1948, my father's family lived in a city called Jaffa, which is right next to what's now Tel Aviv, and Israel's largest city. And my family had lived in Palestine for hundreds of years, in Jaffa for the previous 300 years. My great-great-great-great-grandfather had met Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century there as Mufti of Jaffa when Napoleon conquered the area. And so April of 1947, as the civil conflict is intensifying, there is a massacre of Palestinians by Zionist militias in a village called Deir Yassin outside of Jerusalem. As news of this massacre spreads, people panic. And particularly in Jaffa, which at that point was already surrounded by Jewish militias and was engaged in intermittent fighting and under occasional shelling, a widespread panic ensued. And so my grandfather's partner in a fishing business says to him, my grandfather mainly had a construction company, but he also had this share in a fishing boat. And his partner says, listen, I have to take my family out of here. I'd like to take the fishing boat. You know, obviously I'll bring it back when things are better, but I just don't feel comfortable keeping my family here in this predicament. My grandfather thinks about it, and in the space of one night decides that that our family too would leave. And so in April of 1948, they get on a fishing boat and they make their way north from Jaffa to Lebanon, and then by road on to Syria. And I tell this story because for many Palestinians, the experience of leaving the country in those days between the early months of 1948 and 1950, during that stretch, the experience of leaving the country in fear or being expelled from their homes in some cases, And then, as importantly, of not being permitted to come back to them when the dust settles and armistice lines have been created and a new state of Israel has been established on 78% of what was the mandate of Palestine, with Egypt controlling the Gaza Strip, Jordan controlling the West Bank, and Palestinians stateless, passportless, and lacking a sense of what their future would be. That experience as a whole is known by Palestinians as the Nakba, the catastrophe, and it is a defining experience. And indeed, one of the things that is most difficult about this conflict is that for both peoples, for Palestinians and for Jews, many of the experiences that define us as peoples have been tragedies, have been experiences of profound trauma, and that frames our interaction with each other in ways that, in some ways, poison our interaction, but that also, I think, in some other ways, provide a foundation for a response of empathy, which I hope we can build on and which I hope we can come back to. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward so that we can get to the to more recent history, and just say that,
may I say
Nada, yeah, absolutely.
No, what I want to say is that, you know, that emotional, psychological, and experiential insight of both peoples, you bring very much to your writings in international law and in negotiation. And that's something very admirable, because a lot of people are like kind of cold negotiator, and you understand, you know, the importance of come to terms, and you said empathy, right? Like the bridge those issues in the negotiating table. You work in one of these articles, Shades or Shadows, you know, I mean, it's not exactly about that, but there are insights on that sort, you know, and that is, you know, something that could provide the bridge. Sorry, so 67, you were going to jump on that.
In 1967, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, engaged in some maneuvers that many historians regard as having been saber rattling to get attention, that some historians regard as having been acts of aggression or signaling imminent aggression toward Israel. Whatever the case may be, Israel launched what it characterized as a preemptive strike against Egypt, and simultaneously also against Jordan and Syria. And in 6 days, during what's called the Six-Day War, the June War of 1967, Israel conquered the Sinai Peninsula, which it later returned to Egypt and as part of its peace treaty with Egypt, the West Bank, which remains under its control, the Gaza Strip, which also remains under its control, even though Israeli troops are not normally present within the Gaza Strip, but that's something I'm happy to talk more about later. And Syria's Golan Heights, which also remains under Israeli occupation, and which Israel has annexed, meaning that it's extended its sovereignty over it, treating it as if it's part of the state of Israel.
So yeah. On that note, I wanted to ask you, Omar, something very important that you have worked on, occupation versus annexation. I mean, sometimes people use it interchangeably in whatever. Yes, that word that I can pronounce today.
Interchangeably, yes.
Interchangeable. And if you can give, you know, like the difference that international law, right, in terms of international law, and what had happened politically with the parts that have been annexed and the parts that have been occupied.
Great, absolutely. So the condition of occupation is an old status under international law. And the thing that it's important to know is that international law is neutral about occupation. It's not against occupation, it's not for occupation. When the military of one country occupies another country, then international law says that the occupant has certain responsibilities while doing that. And those responsibilities range from treating civilians in certain ways, a whole array of what are called humanitarian protections for civilians, which are less than the protections we might enjoy as citizens of a country, right? But are more robust than existed prior to humanitarian law's establishment. And there are also dimensions that are meant to protect not just individuals, but the society as a whole that is under occupation. And so we, as an international community, learned during World War II how disastrous it is when, how disastrous it was when Germans were sent as settlers into Poland, into what's now the Czech Republic, when Japanese settled part of China, Manchuria in particular, and made it into a puppet state. In both circumstances, the presence of these other communities made coming to a peaceful settlement after the war all the more difficult. And so one of the things that humanitarian law prohibits is having an occupant settle its civilian population in territory that it occupies, because it's understood not only does this violate the right of self-determination of the occupied population, it makes it much harder to resolve the conflict. And that's going to loom over the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, as we'll discuss later. But while international law is neutral with respect to the status of occupation, since World War II, international law is very clear that territory cannot be acquired by war, right? So it is illegal since 1945 for a state to seize territory in war and to then claim it as its own sovereign territory. And that's what annexation means. And annexation violates Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter. So occupation is okay, so long as occupation doesn't become annexation. And one of the big issues is figuring out when an occupation takes on features that leads one to say, oh, you know what? This is looking less and less like a temporary condition of holding on to territory until an armed conflict is finished, and more like a desire to exercise sovereignty over that territory. Once you cross the line toward exercising sovereignty or toward demonstrating an intention to exercise sovereignty, then you move into the clear realm of illegal annexation. And that's why sometimes you see commentators, including the former Secretary General of the United Nations and a range of legal scholars, including some really important Israeli legal scholars, saying, you know what, Israel's occupation has gone from being neutral to being illegal. Why? Because of the attributes of annexation that it involves. So,
yes.
Yeah.
The Human Rights Watch just issued, but just in April, right, of this year, a report in which, I mean, it's not talking about annexation or occupation, but it's definitely, I mean, the report is called A Threshold Crossed, in which there's also, you know, this kind of non-stated line that has passed qualitatively on a way that, well, it's saying that it's apartheid and persecution, you know, calling on the Palestinian Authority as well. But going back to your point, I mean, between occupation and annexation, there is annexation, like formal annexation, and kind of occupation that is de facto annexation. And in public opinion and politically, there's not much issue made about the annexation as much as with the occupation. Is my perception, is this correct in your view? And why is that, if so?
Well, I think that in relation to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, with the exception of East Jerusalem, which is a big and important exception, come to that in a minute, Israel has so far refrained from annexing territory. And to my mind, that has been, from an Israeli political perspective, a very clever approach to take, because annexation invites or normally would invite a ferocious international response. Remember that when Russia annexed Crimea a few years back, it elicited sanctions from the international community, including the European Union and the United States. And so while we don't always see this unfold, of course, there is realpolitik operating in the world. Crossing that line to annexation is really universally regarded as an illegal act. Now, I think the reason why you see a lot of approbation about occupation is because that's been the legal status of the occupied territory of the West Bank and Gaza Strip since 1967, not annexation. Now that brings us to Jerusalem, and people may wonder, why was there all that fuss about moving the United States Embassy into Jerusalem last year, into or during the Trump administration 3 years ago? And the reason is because Jerusalem was initially in the partition plan that I mentioned by the United Nations, was initially designated to be an internationalized city, what was going to be called a corpus separatum, neither part of the Jewish state nor the Arab state. And accordingly, the international community has never recognized Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, saying this is a really important issue that needs to be resolved through negotiation between the parties. And so when Israel annexed Jerusalem in 1967, annexed the rest of Jerusalem, the international community said, wow, not only are you violating our earlier concern that this is an issue that needs to be resolved in negotiations between the parties, but you're also annexing occupied territory. East Jerusalem is occupied territory. And the United Nations Security Council has been unequivocal through the years in saying this was an illegal act, and it's an act that Israel should reverse. Israel has ignored its demands, and in part because the council has not attached any consequences to them. But the bottom line is that I think the concern about occupation as we now move well past a half century of occupation is that it's looking increasingly not like a temporary condition and more like a permanent one.
Yes, and when I was, when we were all reading about, the Afghan war, or the war in Afghanistan, of the forever war, you think about, Rashid Khalili's, latest book, 100-Year War, or you don't have to read his book to understand that this conflict has been going on for now over 100 years, because he published, into 17. Now Gaza, now the West Bank is divided, it was partitioned into 3 parts, and in terms of the occupation, what international law forbids is the transfer of population from the occupier to the occupied territory, and that's very much the case, with the settler movement colonies, but Gaza seems to be, in my words, right, the eternal return of the repressed, right? In 2 ways, I would say. One, because there's actual repression of the population, but on the other hand, it is like, it brings out the tension, of the Jewish state between the ethno-national line and the liberal democratic line. So Gaza is there to say, I don't want to reduce Gaza to that, but just one of the trends would be to say, hey, we're here, right? You're debasing, the moral basis of your state. Can you talk a bit about Gaza?
Absolutely, I'd be glad to, and I appreciate the opportunity to, because I think that in a range of different ways, Gaza is really it exemplifies the Palestinian condition more than maybe anything else does, and so so let me say, if I may, I'd like to just talk a little bit about how the Gaza Strip was established. So I told my family's sort of refugee, how my family became refugees. But in a very real way, it's important to bear in mind that I could have been one of the people who ended up in Gaza, because whereas my family chose to go north, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians during the Nakba, the period of 1948, 1949, and into 1950 of dispossession, many Palestinians fled behind Egyptian lines. And so as this civil conflict, the civil war is unfolding in Palestine, this place, which had previously been fairly underpopulated, 80,000 people lived in the area that's now the Gaza Strip. It was Gaza itself, Gaza City, was a prosperous market town that was linked to an agricultural hinterland that stretched all the way down to the Negev desert, and was also and then north toward what's now the city of Ashkelon. And in the space of a very short time, 2 years, it goes from being a population of 80,000 connected to this agricultural area to a population of some 200,000 people, and most of whose population is comprised of refugees to a great extent from the areas around the Gaza Strip and from cities like Jaffa in the center of Palestine. And so these people suddenly find themselves living in this small area with a cordon around them under Egyptian administration. And after Israel occupies the Gaza Strip in 1967, they find themselves even further marginalized. And so at present, the Gaza Strip's population, which I believe approaches around 2 million people, is a captive population. Folks are living in an area that is about a fifth the size of Rhode Island, if you can imagine, and that has a dense population, unable to leave, and at the same time, unable to live. The area has become, in the words of one recent study, a toxic biosphere as a result of repeated attacks by the IDF, and as a result of the consequences for the Gazan population of troubles with the water supply. And so the Gazan population really is in trouble. And I think what people don't realize is that this is a population comprised to a very substantial extent of refugees and of people whose dearest wish is to be able to return to the homes of their parents and grandparents in what's now Israel, which of course creates precisely, or raises precisely the question that you teed up a moment ago, Mara, which is what does Israel stand for? To what extent should we see Israel as being merely the state for the Jewish people? To what extent is it a state for all of its current citizens, including the some 20% of its citizens who are Palestinians? To what extent does Israel also need to be the state for the Palestinian refugees who fled or were expelled from its territory and their descendants now some years later? And that's, I think, one of the questions that really animates one of the big issues on the negotiating agenda between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, that you bring that, we have this version of Zionism that actually crystallized, and if we think in a little bit in Arendtian terms, I mean, it's a crystal of elements that are this way, but didn't have to be necessarily this way, right? Because pre-State of Israel, there were other trends of Zionism that were more humanist Zionism. They disappeared very quickly, but granted, but they were there, so that there is this tension between, it's an ethnic state, which it is, because the constitutional law of 2018 made it crystal clear that this is a direction that Israel is taking, at least under Netanyahu, or is it going to take a more kind of democratic stand? Now, a lot of people that even, Peter Beinart, last year wrote, these, articles saying, I'm not anymore for a two-state solution, one binational state. I don't agree with that position, because sociologically, Israel-Palestine is already a binational state, right? There are two people there, but not in the normative and constitutional structure. So this is where we come to, imagining the future and how complex it is with all the sticking points, right? The right of returns, a settler movement that is already there. I mean, many years ago, you already said the occupation has metastasized. We can't extirpate this. It's too difficult. I don't know whether you say we can't. You said it's too costly, sorry. So how do we put all these elements together? The grievances that you mentioned at the beginning, the very pragmatic points, right? The reality on the ground, and at the same time, with the aspirations and legitimate rights of both people in different conceptual frameworks. And this is why, I welcome, you're elaborating on these two models, right? That you develop in this article, divorce without separation. I don't know whether there's alimony there or not.
The big question is custody.
It's custody, right?
So I appreciate your raising the question. I see that my friend David Salem also is keen to talk about this dimension of the questions, and so of the topic. And so let's turn to that. Let me start by saying, for the audience's benefit, that during the years that I was working in Israel-Palestine on the peace process, I had reconciled myself to a two-state solution premised on some degree of separation between Israelis and Palestinians, but not because I had tremendous enthusiasm for that approach, so much as because I thought it was the best that we could do, that even if Palestinians were attached to all of Palestine, including what's now in the state of Israel, and recognizing that the place that my family comes from, Jaffa, will remain within the state of Israel. Mm-hmm. And even if that also meant that Jews would have to cease to live in places that really are in the heartland of ancient Israel, what Israelis call Judea and Samaria, that this kind of approach to partition was maybe the best compromise we could achieve. I think that the combination of dramatic increases in the presence of settlers in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, and the transformation of the Israeli political spectrum, as well as, to a lesser extent, the transformation of the Palestinian political landscape, makes moving in that direction incredibly difficult. I won't say impossible. The French withdrew, more than 1 million, I'm not sure exactly how many pieds noirs, from Algeria. But so it's not impossible, but it is, it would be politically costly and incredibly costly in human terms. So So what are the alternatives available to us? Now, at present, according to a study by RAND, the most popular alternative among the Israeli public is the current status quo, which involves Israel continuing to hold on to all of the territory in this one-state reality that you alluded to, Mara, in which millions of Palestinians are disenfranchised, lack the vote, are unable to vote for the government that decides the most important things in their lives, and also lack freedom of movement over even within the West Bank, but certainly between the West Bank and Gaza Strip and into Israel.
Not to speak about, the removal of livelihood like land, water, communication. Yeah.
Absolutely. So some folks and many Palestinians these days are enthusiastic about different kinds of one-state solutions, either a single democratic state, which is, for example, advocated by Omar M, who is part of the BDS movement, also Jeff Halper, an Israeli sociologist who's been very involved in the movement against Israeli home demolitions. Some say, oh, we should have what's called a binational state where you have democracy, but where each of the ethnic groups has some constitutional protection and some collective rights. I think both of those are interesting approaches to take. My worry with respect to both of them is that is twofold. Number one, that I think it seems incredibly difficult to imagine Israelis simply giving up on Zionism, on the idea that having a Jewish majority state is valuable. And so the political feasibility of that seems remote to me. But putting aside the question of political feasibility, my concern about the one-state solutions that are, or the progressive one-state solutions, not counting some of those that emerged from the Israeli right wing, is that they would pit us in a battle for numerical supremacy in a democracy for the indefinite future. And that has not gone well in most places where it's been tried. And even in places where it has gone relatively better, like South Africa, the numbers were radically different, creating very different political dynamics. And even there, when you look at the predicament of Black South Africans in terms of economic transformation, I'm not sure it's a model that I would say should wholly be embraced with respect to if I'm thinking about Palestinian self-determination. So,
because if I may, the conditions of possibility for such a model based on numerical kind of counting, I know that it's not come out from the sentence very properly, but it's repression of some kind, because you have Lebanon, who has based the whole kind of constitutional political model on numbers and hasn't had a census since 1923.
Well, absolutely. It's a great point. And right next door in Jordan, which also has probably a Palestinian majority, there hasn't been a census taken there for generations, also out of concern about what it would reveal. And so in a democracy, in a multi-ethnic democracy, numbers really matter. And I think particularly in a context where we have this, we're coming out of this toxic history, I would worry for Palestinians as much as for Israeli Jews about consigning us to that kind of competition. So what's left, one may be asking, and this is where, to my mind, one of the most interesting things to come out of the impasse that has prevailed since 2008, really, unless you count the flirtation with negotiations during the Obama administration, which really didn't go well. And I think that there's been new attention given to confederation models. And so folks may be asking, okay, so what does this really mean? And so I'll elaborate on sort of the general principles, and I'm happy to go into more detail to the extent people are interested. But the general idea here is that it is valuable to have two sovereign states in Israel-Palestine, in the territory of Israel-Palestine. A state in which there is a Jewish majority and a state in which there is a Palestinian majority. And when I speak about majorities, I'm speaking about voting majorities in terms of who is entitled to vote in national elections in each of those countries. But the reality is that both peoples are attached to all of the land. That for Jews, there is an attachment to being able to pray in the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron and maybe even live in its shadow. For Palestinians, there is a value to living in a place like Jaffa or Haifa, which loomed at least as large in our history as a city like Nablus or Hebron, Al-Khalil. And so there is an attachment to all of this land. And so what confederations very often have, as we see in the European Union, which is in part a confederal model, is freedom of movement and freedom of residence with some regulation. And of course, it took decades for freedom of movement and residence to fully be established within the European Union. And one would expect that there would be a process through which this would unfold in Israel-Palestine too. But the key point here is two sovereign states with freedom of movement and residence between them. Now, what that means is that a Palestinian could go and live, say, in Jaffa, to buy an apartment in Jaffa, to even participate in local politics in Jaffa, much in the same way that permanent residents here in the United States can run for office in San Francisco if they would like to. You don't have to be a US citizen to participate in politics, even though you may need to be a US citizen to vote, and you do need to be a US citizen to vote in national elections. Mm-hmm. So there's a possibility of engaging in the political life of both places, just not in national elections, which are a critical space for certain kinds of decisions to be taken. And by moving in this direction, not only do you honor both people's attachment to this place, but you also achieve something else. You provide a solution for the issue of settlements, because Israeli settlers, instead of being relocated to what's now Israel, may remain in place and become permanent residents of a state of Palestine. You provide a solution for Palestinian refugees who may return and become citizens of the state of Palestine, but live inside Israel in stone's throw of the places that their families hailed from, and of Jerusalem, which in this framework would become an open city and a capital for both states. Now, this is not obviously an easy solution to implement, and there are many different issues. I've been for the last few months engaged in a protracted negotiation process with a group of Israelis led by a former Israeli justice minister, trying to add a little bit of detail to this, to explore what this might really look like in practice. And there are some things that we disagree about. And my file is security, and I'll say, you know, I get an earful from the former brigadier general whom I'm working with on this paper about how difficult it is going to be to sell aspects of this to the Israeli public precisely out of concern about security. And to be sure, Palestinians are not delighted about the prospect of having Israeli settlers, some of whom are among the most extremist segments of the Israeli population in their midst. But the last thing I'll say about this is, after a long stretch where I struggled to find a solution that honored both people's attachment to all of this land, that took seriously both people's desire for self-determination, and that at the same time undertook to find truly equitable solutions to the array of issues that are on the permanent status agenda between Israel and Palestine. And this, to my mind, is the first one to come around that really ticks all of those boxes, even if it does present incredible challenges, as does incidentally every single other possible solution to this conflict with respect to implementation.
So I found, I came across, this model through you, and I find it fascinating, not only politically, because what it does politically is that it redefines the battle of narratives, because this is a conflict not only of land and rights and resources, but also of narratives. Like, it shifts the narrative instead of, peace for security or land for security, it's redefining the terms, but also conceptually, because it takes the element on the ground and says, this is what we have and this is what we aspire. How can we have the elements conceptual in terms of citizenship, let go of a contiguous state, because that's the key, right? Because in the European Union, even though you have a confederation, you have states that are contiguous, and here it wouldn't be that way. And try to work with rights. It's security for rights seems to be the kind of exchange. And rights are decoupled from a contiguous state, which is the novelty. So it's an amazing work of political imagination, by the way. This has been worked between Israelis and Palestinians together, right? The group is I forgot the name of the group.
So there are a few different groups. I'll actually write in the chat. Let me just get the link here. There is so this idea has been discussed by different folks for a couple of decades, but it's gotten a lot more attention over the last 10 years because of the problem presented by settlements, to be honest, and because of the unwillingness of Palestinians to simply say, oh yeah, we don't care about what happens to Palestinian refugees' attachment to the place that they come from. And increasingly, the compromise, as I was saying earlier, of Oslo seemed to be one that was not going to really please anyone. But to your question, this was advanced by an Israeli journalist named Meron Rappaport and a Palestinian political activist named Auni Meshni. And they've gradually built a grassroots movement, which includes a number of which includes a good number of Palestinians and Israelis. It is still a concept that I think is largely unknown to both Palestinians and Israelis inside Israel and in the occupied territory. But what's interesting about the movement that's developed, and if you go to the link that I've placed in the chat, you'll see this, that it includes people from pretty radically different political backgrounds. On the Israeli side, you have settlers, for example, who say, I may not be representing all of the people who live in my settlement, but I will say that this to me feels like the only decent way for us to continue to live in a place that for us is of profound historic and cultural importance, and to give respect to our Palestinian neighbors who are after all, indigenous in this land. And so it's, to me, it's got a lot of promise, but it's going to take a lot of work.
I find it conceptually fascinating, actually, from like a political theory perspective, like decoupling the citizenship that is political to a national entity that is not contiguous from a more social citizenship. I don't know whether I agree with that term, because that relates kind of to social rights, education, but it's called social in the project, right? But it has to do also with civil and political at the local level. I mean, I find that it requires a lot of reshuffling and rewiring in your mind. But when you think about it, the most important elements, the previously non-negotiables that you went to the negotiating table to negotiate, and they were going to be non-conducive, all of a sudden, they start to make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether I would say, I mean, I would like to hear your opinion about this. I don't know, the defining feature is freedom of movement. I see it as equality rather than freedom of movement, because equality is the condition of possibility for the equal freedom of movement. I mean, it's actually equality of self-determination, of political rights, you know, or civil rights. Why is you know, freedom of movement taking kind of the core, the defining feature of the model?
So I think that equality is a really critical frame through which to see this. I completely agree that we shouldn't lose sight of it. But when people talk about equality, very often their minds go toward a one-state framework. And we'll say, okay, we're talking about equal rights within a single political system, Israel or Palestine, or Israel-Palestine, or Israetin, as Gaddafi suggested a single union be called. But whereas here, to my mind, it is critically important that, in the words of the Biden administration, final solution involve Palestinians and Israelis enjoying equal measures of dignity and security and access to opportunity. That has to be hardwired into the framework that we're talking about. That we are, at the end of the day, still talking about a two-state arrangement. And so it should be two states in each of which we have a heterogeneous polity with Palestinians and Israelis, and in each of which there should be equal rights. But the framing at the end of the day remains one in which there are two states and two opportunities for self-determination, which it's my hope defangs some of the worst aspects of our relationship.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because you're bringing up kind of the connotations of the words in the political discussions, which I'm not privy to. And I saw it from like a theoretical perspective. But that's very important, because, you know, I go back to my own point that I made, and I'll defeat myself with that point, which is, you know, the battle is in the narrative at this point. It is like expanding the horizon of political imagination and how, you know, we frame the terms, you know, in order to have, you know, different conversations. Now, I wanted to ask you, beside this kind of conceptual political model and movement, that I encourage everyone to look at the link that Omar shared, and there are tons of resources there and way to participate if you so wish. I mean, you have worked extensively, or your work also involves extensively the role of the political community, right? The international political community in all of this. So how do you see the role of the international community vis-a-vis this model? That's question number one. And two, the US, this is, you know, not the elephant in the room, it's just the elephant, right? The US support for Israel has prevented, basically, this is my take. I mean, I don't want to, you know, project this to anyone, but I think that a lot of people would agree, right? Prevented a solution, two-state solution, one-state solution, but a solution on the conflict. How do you see now public opinion, you know, and where do you see that it could be disrupted to support like a real fulfillment of aspiration for both the Jews and the Palestinians in Palestine, Israel?
So I think this is where my remarks may get some people hot behind the ears. And so I recognize that what I'm about to say will be hard for some people to hear. And I would just beg you to bear with me for a moment in explaining why I feel this way. So I think that the international community has shown very little resolve when it comes to creating incentives for resolving this conflict. And the fact of the matter is that even though there are constant commitments articulated to a peaceful resolution of this conflict and to self-determination of Palestinians and very frequent criticisms of Israel, there have been very few consequences attached to those condemnations. And I know, for example, that the Biden administration, in a way that is characteristic of American administrations, has been very emphatic in saying that it rejects the idea of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. Now, to my mind, the administration, as well-intentioned as some folks in it are, and I know some of those folks, I think has failed to articulate a coherent theory of change. I think that for most Israelis, the status quo is great. They have a good measure of security, certainly better security than Israel had 20 years ago. And they can feel safe going to work, which is something that Palestinians don't experience under military occupation. The country is going gangbusters economically, and Israelis can travel anywhere they like and enjoy that prosperity once COVID, if and when COVID ever comes to an end.
Permits.
That's right. And so many Israelis say, what's wrong with the status quo? Why should we change? Taking a move in any direction presents risks to us. So why should we take those risks? And I think that it's incumbent for the international community to ask themselves, why should the Israelis change if the international community won't press them to? I think in lots of other circumstances, I earlier mentioned Russia and South Africa, the international community has stepped in and said, hey, when you violate international law, we will impose costs. Does the international community do it every time? No. Is there a measure of inconsistency in international responses? Of course. But if what we care about is actually seeing a resolution of this conflict, to my mind, the only way to move forward is for the folks who are in the driver's seat, which, let's be honest, Israel has one of the most powerful militaries in the world and one of the most powerful economies in the region, and which also ranks pretty well globally. It's in the driver's seat. It controls the territory. It controls all of the movement in and out of that space. It controls the economy. Unless Israelis feel that there is a cost associated with continuing down the path that they're on, they'll continue down the path that they're on. And that is a path that I am confident will lead to more blood on both sides and more tragedy on both sides, if perhaps more on the Palestinian side. And so the international community needs to decide, are we really serious? And I think there's been very little indication of that seriousness, though I thought that in May, during the conflict in Israel-Palestine, or the flare-up, whatever one wants to call it, that there was a clear indication that many people in many countries all around the world we're not willing to just let this conflict go wherever it would.
Yeah. So since you mentioned that, I mean, I mentioned in at the beginning Gaza as the eternal return of the repressed, because it's exactly that. It's containment and violent erupting, but it's not going to go away. That's why I put it in those terms. It's like it's going to come back. But just to break down the international community, I mean, there's public opinion and there's politics internal to each, and every country where this needs to happen. And more people within kind of national political communities are seeing, particularly, particularly for some people. I mean, other people have seen this for like the longest time, after the killing of George Floyd, that there's collective responsibility, for having the benefits of one political community when others do not. Mm-hmm. So along those lines, how would you disrupt or what do you see, which do you see are the political levers to disrupt public opinion, for example, in the US, and you work also on the Middle East, but that's way more complicated since there are like tactical alliance and strategic alliance and religious alliance. But let's start with the US.
So I wish that I could point to magical solutions as far as the US is concerned. I will say that I think there are maybe three avenues that seem important to me. And I think all three of them are already being pursued. So the first is that I think it's important to engage in a measure of reframing of the issues and to help Americans to understand that this is not a conflict between two parties who are in a situation of parity, that this is a crisis with respect to the denial of human rights to millions of people, not only human rights, basic fundamental civil rights to millions of people in Israel, Palestine. And for people to understand that this is not unlike what we have seen before. This is not unlike Jim Crow. This is not unlike apartheid. Now, people can rush and say, oh, but there's this distinction and there's that distinction, but it's missing the forest for the trees. The scale of injustice, the scale of disenfranchisement can't be overlooked and can't simply be subordinated to, oh, well, we need security, and therefore security justifies holding people's rights in abeyance for generations. That wouldn't have satisfied us if it were articulated, and it was articulated by people in the American South. Oh, well, what happens if we give these people these rights? You don't know what's going to occur here. And indeed, if you read 19th century accounts of some of the concerns about enfranchising African Americans in the South, they really were about demographic issues. If you look in some of the southern states, this is before the Great Migration to the North occurred, you see some of these arguments saying we can't enfranchise these people because it will throw off demography. Whites will cease to be a majority in this state any longer. Mm-hmm. Those arguments rightly, I think, would persuade no one in this audience, and they should persuade no one as regards Israel-Palestine either. So reframing this and helping people to understand what is at stake seems incredibly important. And it's striking on that front also that if you look at polling that's been done by the University of Maryland over the last 5 years, Sidley Austin's outfit, what it indicates is that a majority of Americans really see this through an equality lens, equal rights lens. Mm-hmm. And so opinion is shifting. So that's the first thing. Secondly, relatedly, I think that Black Lives Matter opened up a much wider and robust conversation about intersections between issues. And that, I think, necessarily needs to continue. And I think that not only is it critical to keep on building on the political alliances that were created in that context, but to push ourselves to see parallels and to grapple in a really serious way. And I think that it's important for folks on both sides of this divide to understand the lessons presented by the Black Lives Movement, to understand not only why Palestinians identify with the predicament of African Americans and vice versa, or Black South Africans, but also conversely, why Jews are unwilling to return, Israeli Jews are unwilling to return to the predicament of being a minority population in view of Jewish history. There is a need for a multi-directional conversation about our experiences that really is informed by the richness of the debate that's emerged over these issues in the last year. So that's the second thing I'll say. And the third thing I'll say, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn on this front, I think one of the most important developments of the last year has been, and I'm an outsider obviously here, seeing the ways in which the American Jewish community has become increasingly multivocal with respect to the issue of Israel. I see a much richer and more open conversation among American Jews than I've ever seen before. And I find that energizing because I see the possibility of complex alliances forming to do the hard thinking that needs to be done, but also to liberate our political sphere from black and white thinking, so that we're able to sort of talk about, okay, what does a progressive approach to these questions look like without reflexive defensiveness, without identity baiting? I think this is going to take a lot more work, and I can understand the anxiety that attends this, especially in a reality where we see rising anti-Semitism. But I think that this is a really critical moment for American Jews to look soberly at what is being done in Israel and ask, does this stand for the Jewish values that I was raised with? And what can I do to address that? And last little point, I mean, I was in advertising before I became a law professor, before I went to law school. For a couple of years, in our agency, among other clients, represented the what was it called? The Auto Safety Council. I can't remember what it's called.
Which the seatbelt.
Yes, exactly. And when initially the campaign against seatbelts was buckle up and save your life, it was a failure. No one did it. But when they shifted it, Auto Safety Board, that's what it was, when they shifted it to buckle up the one you love, it was transformational, because people will not see the ones that they love take risks, even if they might take risks themselves. And that's why, to my mind, it's incumbent for us to also buckle up the ones we love elsewhere. And to the extent that one is acting out of a love for Israel, it also means not enabling every behavior of a country like that, but instead saying, precisely because we care about what happens, and because maybe you're not fully able to see in the ways that we do the trajectory that you're on, we're not going to just green light everything that happens there.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a wonderful. I was going to ask you about, the buckle up, and also about the story of the parts that turn black. But I want to be fair with our audience, and I have so many questions, about what you just said, but I'm going to, let it like that. There's a generational split, that's surfacing for some time in the Jewish community in the US. And it is related to the fact that, older generations saw the state of Israel as a need for like a very close experiential, right, history. But now that form, the state form, like the ethno-national form, became like a straitjacket, as opposed to, what the new generation is seeing is like, yes, we want a homeland, but this is not, the only way in which, we can have a homeland. But I am going to be fair with the audience. And so Charlotte Prozan, and I'm sorry if I am mispronouncing your name, says Noam Chomsky in an interview with Peter Beinart said that the third alternative is greater Israel. Israel keeps all the territory it occupies and keeps taking bites of Jerusalem and other land that it wants. That's, comment number one. Comment number two, David Salem, in most confederation models, would the national legislators generally have sovereignty on their respective sides of the Green Line with a more complex arrangement for Jerusalem?
Should I respond to these first two comments? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, to Charlotte, thank you for your comment. And, I think that Professor Chomsky is identifying precisely the path that we're on. Israel will continue down that path unless something substantial presses for a new approach. And what we already see is creeping annexation on Israel's part. There is broad support for annexation of parts of the West Bank. And I think at the same time, we'll continue to see not only marginalization of the Gaza Strip in that context, but the Gazaization of parts of the West Bank, with urban areas in the West Bank increasingly cordoned off and placed under pressure, with Israel refusing to exercise responsibility for their fate. So I think Professor Chomsky is right that that's a third alternative. And unfortunately, I think that's where we'll continue to head unless we see a radical shift. To David's question, hello, David. Yes, in a confederal model, one would expect that the national legislature has total sovereignty, or that the national government has total sovereignty over its territory, though depending on the integration of the states involved, there may be some ways in which that sovereignty is contained or constrained. And of course, every state's sovereignty is constrained by all of the agreements it enters into, including, the United States and the, North America Free Trade Agreement and others. And so you would expect for the national legislature to engage in national level policymaking for the state of Israel or for the state of Palestine. In Jerusalem, to your question, it may or may not be much more complex. There are two schools of thought about this. Menachem Klein, who's one fantastic Israeli scholar whose work one really should read if you're interested in understanding, especially the interaction between Palestinians and Israelis before the creation of Israel in 1948. But Menachem, who is himself a Jerusalemite, argues for two municipalities, a Palestinian municipality and an Israeli municipality, that cooperate with respect to a range of questions. But for example, the Palestinian municipality would be answerable up to the state of Palestine and part of the state of Palestine. And so even though there would be cooperation in some areas, there would be importantly a measure of independence for each of these municipalities, which in his view is critically important because specifically for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, there's a need for some different kinds of policies to rapidly advance development in a place that has historically been marginalized. But there are others who say, no, 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 the city is better managed jointly, and that presents more complications to your question about how to arrange policymaking there. Last thing I'll mention, I think on this issue, I think one of the really hard questions, and to my mind, most interesting questions, is whether in a confederation, Israel and Palestine sensibly should remain the centralized governments that they are. Israel is one of the most centralized countries among the modern industrialized countries of the world. And this is in the face of a global decentralization trend. And some have said, you know, Israel could stand to have much more decentralized governance, and Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, remains effectively authoritarian in the current moment, and that's certainly true for the Hamas government as well. And so, even though governance is decentralized, and to some extent in the Palestinian territories between the municipalities and governorates, which have some robust powers compared to Ramallah, it hasn't gone as far as one would hope in terms of political decentralization. Anyway, blah, 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 blah. The key point I'm trying to make here is that what would really make a confederation run much better, to my mind, is if there were an attempt to give far more significant powers to provincial and local governments in Israel and Palestine, so that the gap between citizens and permanent residents could be addressed, so that, for example, an Israeli living in what is now a settlement, but would be a Palestinian city, would have a measure, be able to participate in a robust degree of local government, and same for a Palestinian in Jaffa.
That's a great. I'm jumping in. I want to take on one question, but this is, in the model that two spaces, two states, one space. There's a different relationship between the supranational mechanisms of coordination that need to be not centralized, but strong enough to frame the success of the model, but much more power. It happens. Much more power to the local government, right, where the day-to-day life happens, with a very strong kind of symbolic attachment to the national state. There's one question that is important that I'm going to just bring here in the chat. Arnold Jacobson, what about refusal of Palestinians to accept several peace agreements in the past 30 years? The Oslo Accords were to prepare the two populations to prepare for peace. What have the Palestinians done so far? Hamas does not recognize any Jews living in Israel. How can the Israelis negotiate with Hamas?
Great. So I'm glad to have the chance to speak to those questions. And let me take them out of order. I'll start with the second question, then go to the first, then go to the third. So it's true that the Oslo Accords were intended to provide a foundation of confidence building in preparation for the creation of a Palestinian state. Now, whether that confidence was built, I think, should be judged not solely from the perspective of Israel, but from the perspective of the international community. And in 2014, the World Bank made no bones about it. It said, what we see is that in the years since the Palestinian Authority was created, they have created a not perfect, but fully functioning government that is ready for statehood. And the United States has made very clear again and again and again that the Palestinian Authority's security apparatus has exercised its responsibilities admirably. And indeed, you hear this from Israeli leaders as well. And beyond that, if you look at a range of dimensions of governance, while the Palestinian Authority has, while there are concerns these days, especially about authoritarian tendencies, while there have been concerns about corruption, as we see in, after all, many other states in the region too, and one would hasten to say in our own system as well. While there are still gaps with respect to service delivery and a bloated civil service, the PA has been confirmed by the bank and by most of the international community as having achieved what it needed to do. The question here is how to make good on the promise that was made to Palestinians. You put your house in order and statehood will be forthcoming. And that's something, a promise that's been broken. Now to the question of the peace agreements, as Mara mentioned, I was involved in the peace negotiations that culminated in the Camp David and Taba talks in the year 2000 and 2001. And Palestinians are lampooned as never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But I'll say this, that if you look at the wonderful piece that was written, that was published in the New York Review of Books, and I'm happy to also post this to the chat, by Rob Malley, who is a member of the current administration and was a leading member of the Clinton administration, and Hosseina Agha, a British Palestinian writer. Rob puts it well, which is that the Palestinians were never, prior to Taba, presented with a coherent offer. And to the extent that they were presented with terms, those terms were not generous. Palestinians, since 1993, when we accepted Israel on its current borders, when we said that we would recognize Israel, which we did. Israel has not incidentally recognized Palestinians' right to self-determination still. When we said that, we said, listen, we're prepared to go forward on the basis of having surrendered 78% of our territory. And still in the negotiations, Palestinians were prepared to countenance the annexation of scores of settlements involving tens of thousands of the residences of tens of thousands of Israelis in order to make a move toward peace. We're prepared toward to accept a greatly encumbered right of return for Palestinian refugees. We're prepared to accept that all of the Jewish settlements inside Jerusalem could be annexed by Israel. We're prepared to accept, on top of that, some fairly substantial compromises in the realm of security, including a continuing Israeli security presence in Palestinian territory in tandem with international forces. We're prepared to accept sharing international watercourses, most of whose waters under international law are appropriately allocated toward the Palestinians, and a range of other compromises. What we weren't prepared to accept was an offer that would continue to cantonize Palestinians, prevent us from having a contiguous, coherent space that would enable us to develop economically and politically. And certainly not prepared to accept a compromise in which we were cut off from Jerusalem, which we hold dear, and in which the plight of the Palestinian refugees was not recognized. If you think that's rejection, I think you should look at the details. And in any event, go and look at Rob's piece in the New York Review of Books. I think it's as good a rejoinder to this canard of Palestinians never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity as you'll find. Finally, with respect to Hamas, I'm not a lover of Hamas. I have had face-to-face conversations when I was at the United Nations with Hamas officials, in which I have, without any hesitation, condemned the use of political violence, and in particular the use of terrorism against civilians as being not only illegal and unstrategic, but as fundamentally immoral. Having said that, you need to look at the new Hamas charter, which was adopted in 2018, and which actually, again, it may not be your ideal scenario, but which accepts that Jews are not only a part of the fabric of Palestine now, but will be allowed to remain there. Now, of course, they talk about Jews remaining there under an Islamic regime, which may not be to one's liking, nor is it to Palestinians' liking to live under a government that considers itself to have no responsibility of representing their interests or needs. So I think Hamas is an issue that has to be addressed. I think that one of the, or presents issues that have to be addressed in the context of a broader conversation about Palestinian democracy. And I understand that a few people have said, well, what can we do here to sort of think about Hamas in the context of a confederal model? And this does present issues. I would say two things on this front. One of those things is, of course, that we need to think not only about Hamas, but also about the parties in Israel that are religious, that are advocating ethnic cleansing of Palestinians outside of Israel's borders, that do this unequivocally and unashamedly. One shouldn't forget that hatred is sadly a two-way street in that part of the world, but it doesn't mean that everyone on both sides is consumed by it. And we mustn't forget that. I also want to say that if I were in Hamas, I would be very concerned about the authoritarian drift of the Palestinian Authority and about the ways in which Palestinian illiberalism has been wielded against the Islamic movement historically. And I think Palestinians need to have a hard internal conversation about what political pluralism means. And I understand that that's a hard conversation for Israelis and for American Jews and for others to be spectators of, just as it's hard for me to see someone who is the current Prime Minister of Israel having bragged about the number of Arabs that he's killed in the past. These are hard parts of conflict, but they shouldn't disqualify thinking about concrete ways of creating, ways to create a concrete cooperative structure that is respectful of both parties' aspirations. And I really want to urge folks, I know there is a tendency to say, what about this? What about this? What about this? I get that, but put yourselves in the Palestinians' position. If you lacked freedom, if you lacked the ability to vote for the government that claims to represent your interests, would you accept this whataboutism? Would you regard it to be a reasonable response to your demand for freedom after all of these years?
Well, Omar, thank you. There are more questions. If you would stay with us 10 more minutes, can I abuse your time? Can you do?
Of course.
So I want to highlight this last point. That's an exercise that is difficult for everybody in every circumstance, right? Like, keep the priorities while navigating the nuances and complexities. It's way easier, to say what about and demonize, because it's not easy to navigate the nuances and the complexities, in both sides that this, brings about. I'm not saying, anything new for anyone, but it's something that I experience, daily. So there are more questions. You have them there, but
I can see them. Yeah. Shall I just speak to them?
Sure.
All right,
I read the names just to recognize those who asked. So Jeff, and if you want to read, go ahead. You'll pronounce much better than me.
I don't know. I doubt that, but I'll try to be more succinct than I've been so far. And apologies for my verbosity. Jeff Englander, how does one join A Land for All? So there is an effort to build an Americans for a Land for All, which Chaim Sedler-Fuller at UCLA is leading. And so if you reach out to me, I'll write my email address in the chat. I'm happy to put you in touch directly with Chaim about that question.
So Omar, can you share all these resources, because it would be great to share them with the whole audience as opposed to kind of, you know, burden you personally. If you share this, I want to share the Menachem claim, and actually a lot of people I think might be interested in contacting the organization.
Yeah, with
sorry to interrupt.
Not at all. So Jonathan Marsh asks if Israel and Palestine agreed to a confederatory model, how would Iran and Syria react? I think it's hard to say. I think that it would be much more costly for Iran and Syria to maintain a rejectionist stance if you had a Palestinian state that was not a Palestinian state in name only, of the kind that the Trump administration was advancing, but was instead something that was roughly along 1967 boundaries, had genuine sovereignty, et cetera, and that after all was engaged in a security alliance with the state of Israel, which would be a necessary part of the confederal framework. I think that that would put countries that have historically taken a confrontational stance in a bind. And I would hope that it would yield a realignment, but I think that what it at least would do would make it far more costly to oppose moves toward peace than it was, for example, during the Oslo Accords, where one could say these agreements are nonsense. It's way too much of a compromise. So I'm optimistic on that front, but of course one never knows. Jay Rips asks, is there any indication that Hamas and its constituencies are receptive to a one-state confederation model rather than the elimination of the state of Israel? Yes, I have seen some indication of that. Hamas has already indicated receptiveness toward a two-state solution. And although they frame this in terms of a hudna, a long-term truce, which enables them to kind of frame this as not accepting Zionist control over the Holy Land. But I think that it is their pragmatic kind of effort to say, yes, we would go along with this if this were actually feasible. Of course, they say this recognizing that there's very little chance that Israel is going to move in this direction. So I would love to see Israel actually test Hamas by moving in the direction of a genuine peace. I think Palestinian public opinion would very widely welcome a move of this kind. I don't think that you would see hard divisions if the kind of deal that I've spoken about were a reasonable proposition.
Last two until we have Joyce and Debbie. Oh my God, I don't want to abuse your time, Omar, but if you can take the three and address them briefly.
Sure. I have been mentioning Hamas quite a lot, and I think Israel didn't fire the first rockets in the spring, but it's important to bear in mind, and I introduced the history that I did at the outset, that Palestinians who live in Gaza are a captive population and are largely a refugee population denied the right to return to their homes inside Israel. And so it's not just a question of asking who fired the first rockets in the spring. It's looking at how Palestinians in the Gaza Strip have fared and what is the cause of their predicament. And so I'll leave that at that. The offer by Ehud Olmert in 2008, at the conclusion of his negotiations with Abu Mazen, I think was a promising step in the right direction. I'll tell you, there were two main reasons why Abu Mazen was unable to say yes to Olmert at that juncture. The first was that Olmert was proposing to annex two of the largest settlements, including one area. I mean, both of them go deep into Palestinian territory, but one of them, Ariel, goes so deep into Palestinian territory that there was a genuine concern not only that it would destabilize a peace agreement, because of the political issues surrounding it. And if you see, Ariel is literally in the middle of the West Bank, but it also would have been an incredibly difficult settlement to provide security for. And that was, to my mind, one of the core issues there. The other core issue was that Olmert was on his way out as prime minister. And I think Abu Mazen was understandably reluctant to sign a deal with a prime and make some pretty far-reaching concessions with someone who was already under attack politically and who very shortly thereafter lost the premiership. I will say that I really respect the passage that Olmert traveled, and I think many in Palestine, many among Palestinians also respect the distance he went. And I think, as with the peace talks that I was a part of, that with more time, we might have moved toward, we might have been able to achieve a resolution of the conflict. I would not believe those who say that Palestinians are constitutionally unwilling to accept peace. I can tell you, as one of them, and as someone who's worked in that government, I would not have accepted either of those offers, but I believe in peace with all of my heart and believe that a fair peace is within reach. With respect to the play Oslo, I think it's a very interesting one. I worked for 2 years for Terry Rod Larson, who is one of the protagonists. He was the United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process when I worked in his office. And so I'm well acquainted with him. And I think the play is, I think it makes an interesting attempt to convey the challenges associated with finding a starting point for peace, and the personalities involved, the complexity of the personalities involved. I think there was some finessing with respect to those personalities for a range of reasons. And I know the Palestinian and Israeli personalities quite well. And I'm not sure I see them so well reflected in the play, but I think it's nevertheless quite an interesting window into a really important episode, and I think it's worth watching.
Can I, Omar, ask you to finish with that story about the black parts that you told a few years ago about Oslo, and given that, there was a question about Oslo.
Sure.
I think it's in order to end on
sure.
legally note.
When I received the offer to go and work in Palestine in 1999, I went to the managing partner of my firm and asked if I could take a leave. And he said he wasn't sure. And so he asked a guy named Joel Singer, who was also, at the time was of counsel at the firm, running the government contracts business, and had been the IDF counsel who, to a great extent, wrote the Oslo Accords, the first Oslo Accords, the Declaration of Principles, and even Oslo II. He was enormously involved. And so he, on my behalf, advocated on my behalf with the managing partner, saying, Carter, it's better for us to have someone on both sides in the firm. It's very good for business. And Carter accepted that. Anyway, at the kind of farewell cocktail for me, Joel, and I'll stop with my terrible Israeli accent, was there. And I was introducing him to my paralegal, and I said, this is Joel Singer. He's the architect of the Oslo Accords. And my paralegal said, looked at me quizzically, not knowing what I meant by the Oslo Accords. And I said, well, he wrote the agreements that we'll be working for the coming couple of years to reach an agreement on doing. And so Joel says, so is that the goal? And I said, isn't it? I mean, there's self-consciously temporary arrangements. And he says, let me tell you a story. A guy goes to the doctor because his private parts have turned black. And the doctor, sort of with an ashen look, runs some tests and then says, "I'm very sorry to tell you, sir, but we'll have to amputate." The guy goes out of his mind. He gets like 10 subsequent opinions. All of them reach the same conclusion: we'll have to amputate. So in an absolute panic, he begins looking for alternative approaches, alternative therapies, and he goes to a practitioner of Chinese medicine, and this guy, looks very closely, and after doing all the necessary things, says, "Okay, I think I know what we must do." And the guy says, "Will it be necessary to amputate?" And the doctor says, "Oh, no, 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 no." And the guy looks visibly relieved. And then the Chinese doctor says, "It will fall off on its own." And I said, "So that's what we should believe about the Oslo Accords?" And Joel just goes,
we don't really know what that means, what that would mean. Maybe it's a good thing that it's going to be superseded, but something that will allow us, with humanism, political imagination, and the conceptual creativity that you brought us today, to reimagine a better future for all. Omar, it's been an honor. I invite you all to join the discussion session at 4. Maybe let's start 4:10. So people get some few minutes just to breathe all this in. Omar, it's been an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please share with me, all the resources so we can share with them your articles and also more details about the IPC, the
decree study. Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Okay, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Mara. And thank you to our staff.
Thank you for your time today. That was a great kickoff.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Thank you, everybody. Shukran, Omar.
Shukran, Mara. Thank you.